Welcome back to Purple Elephant Radio. If you're watching the video version of this, you'll probably notice that I'm not in my normal spot where I do the video podcast, not sitting in my normal chair. That's because this is going to be a very special episode. I've asked my cousin Zach Greene to come on. He's been on the show way back when, I think one of the first 10 episodes of Purple Elephant Radio. But I've asked him to come on and interview me about the book. So we dove into specific themes, as well as just talking about the culture at large and what really inspired the book, what it's about, and why you should buy it. Yes, there is going to be a little bit of promotional stuff, but it was a really engaging, rich episode. I really liked the conversation with him. He asked really good questions. So I just want to say thank you for tuning in. Enjoy the episode.
Super pumped to be here today, talking about Off of This Head. My brother Sean here, I'm super proud of him for coming out with this book. I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing yet, but I have gotten a chance to read the intro and some of the poems, and it's just been awesome. And again, proud of you, excited to read the whole thing, and definitely want to hear your take on some of the highlights of the book, what folks should expect from it, and again, just kind of get into your head a little bit about how this process has been. So kind of starting it off, I think for me, coming from someone that's never written a book, or not necessarily hasn't aspired, but I mean, I would like to one day. It just hasn't been something I'm looking to do anytime soon, I don't think. Would love to kind of know the process. What were, give me just right off the bat, what were the biggest challenges, hurdles, and then what were the most gratifying components of writing this, and putting a lot of time into it, which you clearly have.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just want to say, first of all, thank you for doing this interview. I mean, I'm probably going to do some type of intro piece before this, but I really picked you specifically to do the interview for this book, just because I think we've had conversations a lot related to this stuff in this book, which we're going to get into in a second, but thank you for doing this. In regards to the question, I mean, really my process was just blocking out the time every day, but not necessarily having a set schedule. I was just talking to someone about this, where when it came to the actual writing, there was never like, by this day I have to finish this chapter, by this point I have to be publishing. So there was no deadlines until it became clear, like, okay, the thing's all done. Now I'll set the actual release date a month in advance. So it kind of worked like that. So I would say the biggest hurdles with it, I mean, because I love just writing when I'm writing, and that's something that I talk about in the book, but I would say the biggest hurdle was, for pretty much every essay, I wrote it once, like, oh, this is great, this is going to work well, read it back, and just had to start from scratch. The first few times I was like, oh, this sucks, I really have to start from ground zero. But like 4 or 5 essays in, I realized that I really like that process of write as best as I can. And then a little bit later, when I'm having to rewrite it, it's not like I'm starting from scratch. I have all this stuff. I've clarified my ideas in the first round, but now I kind of get a blank canvas with this clarified idea already in place.
That makes sense. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. It's funny, that kind of takes me to something that you've said previously. I think on podcast, on Purple Elephant podcast, talking about an artist or a writer not creating for the masses or for the public to perceive it, but for themselves. So I think in this process for you, it sounds like it was important for you to just continue to write for yourself and ultimately come out with a product that ultimately reflects that. And again, from what I've read and just in the intro, it seems to have done that. To me, the introduction was, definitely was reminiscent to some of the books that I know you and I share a liking towards, books like The Untethered Soul, Power Now. I know, Eckhart Tolle is someone that's very influential for you. Definitely curious, and again, I know there's more than just the spirituality component to this book, but definitely curious to kind of hear like what some of your inspiration was in putting this together.
Yeah, I mean, I think Eckhart Tolle is like the big inspiration for this. Like the back cover, I said something about it. I reference him throughout. But then I would say indirectly, I mean, because I wouldn't necessarily attribute it to a specific person, but a lot of like Buddhist and Hindu ideas I drew a lot from, specifically like Hindu mysticism.
Okay.
So not like the gods of Hinduism, but what I would say is like, and I might be talking out of my ass here, but the Vedanta tradition, that's much more focused on, and again, we'll get into the depth of it in just a second, but self with a capital S.
Yes.
That's kind of referencing not the ego, which might be the conditioned self, the personality. And so kind of distinguishing those two, I would say I've really gotten from Hindu mysticism, and then like I don't like using the term New Age people, but people like Eckhart Tolle, the Michael Singer of Untethered Soul, and Rupert Spira, who it's talked about a little bit in the book, but he's someone where very similar to Eckhart Tolle, but first of all, he has more books, and he's so simple in the message. I think it's non-dualism is kind of his train of thought. So yeah, I mean, long-winded answer, but I tried to combine a lot of that just as it's impacted me specifically.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And again, I know we'll get into some of that as we kind of talk into the book a little bit here. I know I just wanted to start off with some more questions. And again, outside of the book, speaking to kind of what folks can expect, without diving into some of the main aspects of the book. But yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about, just someone that is either at a bookstore or, nowadays, as we know, on Amazon, or, they hear about it from a podcast or from a friend. What, who, not necessarily who should read this book, but who would be, someone that would benefit from this book? What would someone look to gain from reading this book in a time where there's a lot of noise in the world, whether it's podcasts, whether it's Netflix, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, YouTube? Picking up a book is different than what it used to be. And I still think it's one of the, I like to look at it as a ritual. It's something that's, ritualistic. It's very important to sit down, quiet the mind, and, and read. And so, yeah, curious to kind of hear what you think, who you think the audience is for this book, and, what they would gain from reading a book like Off With His Head.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I would say, and I've been thinking a lot about this, because, I mean, of course, you need a target audience. You need people to actually buy the book. But something you had said earlier, in a lot of ways, especially with the poems, I was writing for myself to clarify ideas for myself and just kind of sort of hoping people would like it. But as now with the final product, I can say pretty clearly that the people I'm trying to reach are people who would already be listening to, watching those types of thinkers and spiritual teachers that we had talked about before. So if you like The Power of Now, or if you've heard of The Power of Now, like that type of person, I think would really enjoy this book. But I would also say it's very different from that book in the sense of half the book is about that non-dualism, that kind of self with capital S. And then another section is specifically diving into the world of polarization, chaos, digital overload. So kind of balancing what I would say is the spiritual, lofty, this sounds nice as a concept, and bringing it to the world of actual day-to-day, like practical living. And when it comes to who that would actually be for, anyone living in a first world country that feels that they're kind of getting engulfed, swallowed in this sea of information, feeling like, the way I see it, I think this the social media stuff is making us more cynical. And so anyone who is either done with that cynicism or just feels kind of lost and hopeless because of everything they're consuming online, who needs an outlet that I would consider is not a negative outlet. It's not turning to drugs or alcohol to numb the pain, but sort of seeing the pain for what it is and going beyond it. I know that wasn't a super specific answer.
No, that was great. As you started it, I was kind of hoping you get to that where you got to in the second part, because, as much as it is for the folks that are into the Eckhart Tolle and the spiritual components of the book, in the intro, I really kind of distinctly remember you talking about when people are reading this book and if they're feeling a sort of way and they're feeling resistance. That was one of the big themes of the intro that really caught my attention. In life, for me, resistance is something that the more, and again, obviously a long way to go, like we all do, the more I'm becoming aware of certain thoughts, resistance is something that, I notice all of the time. And I think that you said the American, the person living in a first world country, I mean, we are constantly in a state where, we're being thrown information left, right, center. It's very polarized. I think I couldn't agree more. I think, the person that may resonate, or not necessarily resonate, but the person that may need to read this book the most would be, more your average American. So I think let's kind of get into that a little bit. I think it's a good time to kind of transition into that aspect of the book. And again, the world we live in right now, we don't need to go into the details of it in terms of how polarized it is and people receiving targeted ads on social media and all of the, again, whatever you believe in, clearly you are being, given that information over and over, and you're choosing to receive that, that type of information.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about this book. So what did you focus on in the book? I only had the pleasure to read the introduction.
Yeah.
What did you really focus on as it relates to the world at large today? And, I should say really America or first world countries.
Yeah.
As it relates to kind of that, polarized, digitized world that we currently live in.
Yeah. So I think, it just really quick before I jump into it, when you talk about resistance, I just want to make sure like people listening understand what that means. Because the way I define it a couple different times in the book, but for me, it's like when you feel an emotion like anxiety or anger, or it's a very like high strung emotional state, resistance is the literal body sensation. That's what I'm kind of defining it as. And I think we're so quick to say, oh, I'm stressed, I'm anxious, using these words, using these concepts, but sort of glossing over what are you feeling in the body? Is it a tightness in the chest? Does your skin feel like it's crawling? And so a lot of times people aren't wanting to feel those negative sensations. I mean, rightfully so, they're uncomfortable. But I think resistance really refers to when it is glossed over, when you are distracting yourself from it, it just gets worse.
Yep.
And it just grows, and that's when it becomes chronic stress or chronic anxiety.
Couldn't agree more. I have something else later that kind of goes, that I want to ask you about, that kind of talks about the concept of feeling versus thinking, and kind of that, the knowledge versus more the innate wisdom. And I think that's important. I feel like you talked about that a little bit in here, at least in the beginning. But my question, I think, was really more of just asking you, in the book, for the reader that's interested, maybe just a quick kind of high level overview of how you dive into the world of, again, whether that's, you want to call it political, what we're getting, in front of our faces, media wise, everything from politics to cancel culture, all these different components that I know you speak to a bit in the book. Maybe just kind of a high level overview for folks that are looking to pick it up.
Yeah. So if I had to summarize like the theme of the book or what the book is about in just a few words, I would say is realizing what your ego is and sort of redefining that from what Sigmund Freud might have said, looking at it more as an encompassing sense. And I could get into what that actually means in a second, but know what the ego is in yourself specifically, recognize when it's there in the moment. So a lot of times when I talked about resistance, if you're resisting it, those thoughts that are distracting you from the feeling, that's egoic thoughts. So know what it is, recognize it when it's popping up, bubbling up as thoughts, and see that you are not that. And it's as simple as that, but it's also difficult in the moment. I mean, as anyone knows, if you're angry and someone says, take 10 deep breaths, you're going, I'm still angry. So I think the biggest thing is sort of I mean, this book is about identity, not in the politicized sense, but in the sense of you are not the ego.
Yeah.
And so I could say that, I mean, I know you know what I'm talking about, but it is something where you have to experience it before you realize what's being talked about. And then when it comes to the political, moral kind of, I almost say, I think in one of the essays I'd say people are being pricked like a voodoo doll, where they're on YouTube or Instagram or whatever, they're feeling angry, outraged, scared, all these different emotions that are negative. I mean, practically we know these days that social media is addictive. It's harmful, and yet we're all still on it. I mean, I know you're not on it very much. I'm not on it very much. But the vast majority of the people are what I think the irony, just as a little tangent, is that people are getting a lot of this information, I'm sure, whether it's spiritual based information or stuff about like, we're not all this extremist stuff. We're all somewhere in the middle. Sort of this rational content exists online, but it's 60-second sound bites.
Yeah.
And
long form. Yeah.
Yeah. People aren't really taking the time to not only look at long form, because I mean, I watch a lot of long form podcasts and things like that. But no one's taking the time to, when the devices are away, think about it.
Yeah.
And honestly go beyond the thinking, or, notice your thinking rather than being kind of trapped in your thinking. So yeah, it's the moral and the political are something that have gotten fused together. And that's the thing that, the way I see it, that's what's leading to the chaos and radicalization. So yeah, that if you want to get into that more, we can, but if you had something else.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And again, just kind of hearing you separate the two and then kind of talking about how they're fused together, I do think it's really interesting to think about kind of that first piece, the ego dissolution, more the consciousness, and how that can actually come into play as it relates to politics, whether that's, again, third party folks that are looking to get into the election and maybe people being excited about them, but realistically knowing that, it's probably going to stick to a two-party system and there's not really much of a chance for anybody aside from the Democrats or Republicans. There's a lot that goes into that, right? So I think for me, a lot of conversation right now is around consciousness, and that can be conscious capitalism, that can be a shift in consciousness. I think people are excited about that. To me, when I look at that, though, there's a couple of things that stick out and a couple of big issues. And I think in our, right now we're currently in St. Louis and we're in a city, and, I think when you leave the cities and you go to what ends up being 90% of our country, is there really that shift of consciousness that's occurring? Are we really getting to that point? Or is it really just occurring here in more of these urban centers? And then again, maybe good and bad happening in these urban centers, but what's actually happening at a broader scale? And again, I'm not sure how much you talk about it in the book, but I think it's interesting to kind of think about that as well in terms of how do we, and maybe it's folks that don't live in and around these urban centers that can pick up a book like this and see that they're, people that live in a city maybe see it on both sides. They see that there's a polarization happening on both the left and the right. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really important. I think it's something that needs to be more openly discussed and not as much of, and I think you mentioned in the introduction, as soon as somebody has a viewpoint that makes them angry, they put their defense mechanisms up and they resist. And it causes this challenge, this kind of fight or flight mentality. Mm-hmm. So I think my point being that shift in consciousness, not only is it incredibly important, but what can this book do to help others, explore that shift in consciousness, not necessarily push it on other folks, but just open the conversation, open the dialogue up so that, more people can approach it with an open mind.
No, and I'm really glad you said that last piece, because when you were saying, maybe there is a more of a shift in consciousness in urban areas versus rural areas, that is something I talk about, but indirectly. So I think the one thing that I think gets mixed up these days, especially when it comes to the not just fun spiritual content on social media, whether it is, I'm not trying to insult any of these things, but like astrology, very artistic, very fun, very lighthearted, horoscopes, that type of thing. I think that's what maybe most people think of when it comes to spirituality, who haven't maybe dove into the like ancient Eastern religions. But I think that the issue is almost, it's not just that, or I'm almost weary of saying, oh, urban centers are doing so much better than rural areas. I think that, and I mean, depending on what domain you want to talk about, but when it comes to who has the better moral views, who is the most moral, and I think predominantly, if we're talking about rural areas, maybe they're more Christian based, maybe they're stronger beliefs in Christianity or Catholicism, and then the urban centers, I mean, I didn't look at specifically where religion has been declining, but it is statistically declining. And whether it's atheism or agnosticism, that is increasing. And so that is a big theme in the book. I don't think that it's enough to just say, Christians or Catholics they don't know what they're doing. They're not accepting all people. I think there's extremes that really, are totally blind to they're being discriminatory, they're being unfair, they're being dogmatic. But I think we all know that. I think it's been a long time coming, and people understand that it's not the 1950s, it's not the 1960s. I'm sorry to say, but I don't think Christianity dominates the conversation as it did back in those decades. But I think that it would be an error to say we need to fill that void with a new, whether it's ideology or religion. That I think is what has led to more extremist views on the left.
Yes.
And so I've heard arguments about how, social justice activism is a new religion, or being woke is religion, something like that, pseudo-religious.
Yeah.
I think there's an argument to be made for that, but I think it's too decentralized to say that. I think people are finding these viewpoints on social media, but they're not like going into a building and praying to a activist god or something along those lines. So it's more disjointed than that other side of things.
Yeah.
But I think, and I say this in one of the poems, I think that the talk of collective consciousness and shifting in consciousness, we have to be really cautious, because first of all, we can basically treat people who still believe in organized religions, Catholics and Christians, Jewish people, Muslim people, sort of outside. They don't get it. They're still in that lower level. We run the risk, I think, of falling into the same traps that they did.
Totally.
And so I think when people are getting the information on social media and not long form conversations, not reading, not even a book like this, but older books, the Tao Te Ching, things like that. When people are just skipping that and going straight to the TikTok influencers talking about it, I think there's going to be errors. And I would say I'm no exception. I could be making errors in this book, but I really try to be as faithful to what I would say are those older traditions as possible. And at some point, you have to stop calling them traditions and just say it's experiencing it right now.
Yeah. No, it's a really good answer. And a lot going through my head after that one. I mean, I think kind of going back to initially where we were at, and then we can kind of keep moving.
Yeah.
Because I know I don't want to stick on one point too long. But it made me think of something, again, going back to kind of the urban versus rural. And, I think that on the rural side, or more maybe, you said maybe they're more Christian based, maybe it's kind of like, I think you kind of talk about it a little bit in the introduction, is some of that like feeling versus the thinking mentality. It's almost like knowledge versus wisdom. And then you can kind of bucket it if how you'd like, but almost, maybe more of that away from the cities is more of just that feel, and it's kind of just you're out there doing it. You're maybe not as you're not in the books, or you're online as much, but you're out there doing it, and you're, whether that's your in the field, in the garden, And then there's folks that are, more in the books and in the universities and the urban centers. So in my opinion, I think that's a perfect example of maybe where we need to find the mesh of those two. And if we can do that, then maybe we really can experience that true shift in consciousness. I think right now we're talking about it, and I think it's slowly happening, but I truly think it's going to take folks from both sides to really be able to come together and, spread that to more of the masses. And I think that kind of leads me to, I really like that feel versus think mentality. It's something for me personally. You spoke about it, I think, 5-10 minutes ago, kind of around anxiety, right? It's like, I'm anxious. I don't know what is going on. I feel anxious. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? What do you feel? Is your chest tight? Is your head hurt? Your skin crawling? Or you think, I just think I'm anxious, right? So feel versus think, I think, is something where trying to feel into life a little bit more. You told this story in I believe it was the intro, but it may have been the poem. I can't remember. It was about the Buddha and the flower.
Yeah.
The introduction. Yeah. I would love that you maybe just kind of have you give a quick synopsis of that story and, the importance of that. I think there's a lot that kind of resonates throughout from what you've said throughout the book and just in terms of life in general from that story.
Yeah. And so that story, I think I got it from either Alan Watts or Eckhart Tolle. And I mean, Alan Watts is someone I didn't really mention before, but I think my historical knowledge of Buddhist traditions, I mean, I would say he is the number one person for that. And so the Buddhist flower sermon, basically as a summary, the Buddha, after he had started teaching some people started following him, Buddhism was starting. One of his sermons was he just picked a white flower, held it to, 15, 20 people, didn't say a word. And no one really understood what was going on. Where was the message? What was he there to teach us? And it was said that only one person got it and smiled and just enjoyed the flower. And so that is sort of something that gets brought up a lot, the thing we can't talk about. The unspeakable world. So that is an example of it. I mean, I'm talking about it now. That's not the thing. What I always like to say is, in the book, right after I reference that, the thing is you reading this book right now. And the thing is us talking right now. So yes, that stands as a symbol, but don't get lost in the story. The story is always meant to point to the now. So yeah, I think I really, really like that story just as a symbol. Is really simple. And I think it conveys this really not complex idea, but so simple it seems absurd. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it did kind of, to an extent, I know it's a little bit different, but it kind of reminds me of I don't know if it was Ram Dass, but I know he at least references the quote that the mind is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. Mm-hmm. And it's just kind of this thing where it's use your mind in the right way to read the book, to watch the movie, but don't necessarily treat it as the master and have your mind wander. And again, I mean, we could all use a taste of our own medicine as it relates to that, and that's human nature, right? So yeah, I think kind of going a little bit more into, I know the says right here, it says, guide to spiritual awakening in a polarized, digitized, and tribalized era,
and that is changing, but two of those words are the same.
Okay, sounds good. Well, sorry to call you out.
No, it's all right. It's all right.
But again, I love that. Again, I think it does it justice in terms of, again, what the intro says, and then what I'm sure the rest of the book is going to get into. And I think it's something that you talk about a lot, whether that's in some of your writings, your podcasts. Let's talk a little bit about the digitized piece. So let's talk about this kind of the world we live in, 2024. AI, machine learning, job cuts, economy's still going up. Folks are, losing their jobs because people are prepping for, more automation. How, as we're still kind of on the consciousness kick, maybe talk a little bit about how you think AI can play a role in some of this shift in consciousness. I know in previous conversations with you, where some folks are very doomsday around automation and AI, I think you take more of an optimistic view. And I know you still have your concerns and doubts, but I think there's times where you have a more of an optimistic viewpoint on how it can, change the world potentially for the better, as long as we go about it the right way. maybe you'd love to just have some dialogue about that. I think it's important, and sounds like it's a key point in the book.
Yeah, and so I'll just speak to my own. You could almost say a fall and then a rise when it comes to AI, where initially I was more doomsday, and now I wouldn't say I'm so optimistic about it, but I sort of see it getting weaved into the same amount of ego caused problems as before. So I do think, yes, there are ways that it can help quite a bit, but I just see it almost becoming more of the status quo, intensifying the insanity of the mind that's already there. So in that sense, I'm optimistic that it might so accelerate all this chaos that people are sort of forced to awaken. And one specific example of that is, let's say professional based uses of AI, where maybe some jobs are getting displaced. Maybe it's someone who codes, 10 people get laid off, one person stays, and they just kind of manage the AI. Of course it is disappointing to realize that AI is better than you in these specific tasks, and it's going to continue to get better. I should have actually said creative uses, because that's the biggest thing, where for a long time that seemed like robots can't be creative.
Right.
I mean, you look at image generators, you look at text generators, they can be creative even if they're just copying old human work. So yeah, I don't think they're making things on their own, but they have that potential. And it's like for every stupid error that a 4-year-old could spot that the computer didn't see, give it a couple of years and they are going to be fixing those things. So I'm not one of those people that I do notice some of these people, not all the time, maybe a little bit of an older person seeing a simple mistake that an AI makes and thinking, humans are still better. I mean, it is just a matter of time that AI is going to be better at that specific task.
Yep.
So I think what needs to happen, and again, coming back to the coder who lost their job. Yes, it sucks. I'm not going to talk about what you need to do to find another job. That's not what this is about. But in that instance, you can realize that the AI is better at this specific skill, but that specific skill, which you've been drawing your identity from, you don't need to. So what that basically means, if someone had invested their whole sense of self in, I'm a coder, I make a ton of money, I'm really good at my job, and suddenly they're replaced by something that can do it better, not have to get paid for it, and et cetera, that might be a moment for despair. But I see that moment as sort of a forceful letting go. And so that is, we talked about the resistance earlier on. When people stop resisting moments like those, it seems like, why would I resist that? I should, try to get my job. I should try to get another coding job. And I'm not saying not to do that. But I'm just saying, can you observe that even if his AI is better than us at every metric we normally use, creativity, rational thinking, creative problem solving, so what? That's the way I kind of look at it. And yes, the doomsday element, there could be a AI uprising, an AI takeover. I'm not really concerned about that. When it happens, we'll all know about it. I don't think there's unless you're focused on safety precautions related to AI, the average person does not need to be thinking about that. Mm-hmm. It's only going to create, again, stress in the moment, in the body. So yeah, taking it from this abstract thing to right now, that's always bringing it back to that.
Yeah. I think, I thinking about kind of that as it relates to, the ego and then like, again, the resistance component of AI, it seems like now, and again, it's hard to actually make it happen on the individual level, but now would be a good time to go all in on working inwards and preparing ourselves for these moments with AI and what changes are to come. I think, the positive side of that too, the more optimistic side says, if certain jobs are lost, well, there's gonna be more opportunity, more creation, more ways to look and say, okay, if it's gonna go that left, now what's coming on the right? What can I, was Wayne Gretzky said, where can I skate to? Not, where the puck is.
Yeah.
Where's the puck going? So figuring out what that looks like. So yeah, I think there's a lot that we're gonna have to figure out and on the fly and learn quickly. but I think AI can definitely help. I just think we just need to, we need to be cognizant of the risks, like you said. And I think it's something that we can't bear all the stress ourselves. There's people that are going to be, unfortunately, caught up in it, and
hopefully getting paid to be stressed about
exactly getting paid a lot, of course. And then again, taking the approach of what could this lead me to? What's next? Wow, that's exciting. A new hobby, a new career, something maybe I find more purpose in doing than I previously did. So I think that's awesome. So it kind of just going through some of the main themes of the book. I do want to touch a little bit more on the ego. And I think that the ego piece is critical. I know in the book you talk about, and I think a lot of people that have read, self-help, or, I Heard Told, or, some of these, Untethered Souls. I mean, the capital S self is pretty commonly found. I think it's in
some form or another, different words for it.
Yeah, people like to use that, talking about myself with S being capitalized. It's definitely a spiritual use of the word. I think it's very important as it relates to cancel culture and some of these, social justice, social injustice, what's going on in the world today as we see it. I think it's pretty interesting to kind of look at ego and some of those major themes that exist in the world, and especially in the US, and how do they kind of intersect. In my opinion, there is an intersection between ego and some of those themes, because I think folks like to kind of put themselves out there, right? That they're this again, very open, or they're doing these different things, and at the end of the day, I think a lot of times actions speak louder than words. And I think we see a general population that oftentimes is not showing compassion and is not loving, and they are resisting, and they are being defensive. And I think, again, coming back to really basics, really simple basics, is love, I think, is a huge word that needs to be more openly utilized. And, we all need to be more compassionate. But how do you look at kind of the intersection between ego and some of these, almost, the tribalism, modern, cancel culture and thing, and that.
Yeah. So I think there are basically two sides to it: the person getting canceled, and then the mob, you could say, that is trying to cancel them. And it doesn't have to just be, canceled for any number of reasons. I think the main thing to know, basically from the mob side of things, I think because of social media, because of the echo chambers, because of the curated content bubbles, specifically ideological bubbles, which maybe we can talk about that in a little bit, but ideology plays a big role in how the ego identifies. Basically the ego is going to say, I'm not this, I'm that. I'm not a bad person, I'm a good person. And what does a good person do? They stop talking to people who think like that. That's not always a bad rule, but it's become intensified. The sort of threshold for offensive behavior keeps getting lower and lower and lower, until someone says accidentally a microaggression, and suddenly their friends are like, I don't want to talk to you anymore. So there are a whole ton of different angles you could take, from the most extreme cases to the most subtle cases. What it all boils down to with the mob mentality is that, if you realize that it was egoic thoughts pushing you to reject this person, to shun this person, that wouldn't mean you don't hold them responsible for their behaviors. That wouldn't mean that, if they deserve to be fired for whatever reason, that they don't get fired. But it would mean that you don't have to add that extra layer of thought on top. That extra layer of thought that says, you did this, it's really wrong. I'm going to make sure everyone knows that it was really wrong. I'm going to make sure my whole group is on the same side as me and understands what I'm thinking. I think that urge is so natural. But it's so natural, it's so easy, but it's something that we have to grow beyond. Because social media is exploiting it. That's why. Like, before social media, it's not so bad to have a little coalition of people that, we're going to make sure that these people, like neo-Nazis, make sure they stay out of stuff. But it has been amplified,
right?
In the words we use. So that's another thing that I like to talk about in this, is when it comes to language. A lot of the like postmodernists, I don't know where you want to draw the line there, but basically from like the 1940s to 1960s, 1970s, and then in the decades past that, there was a fixation in philosophy on language. And do words have multiple meanings? And, if we take a binary of words like male and female, is one seen as better or worse? And can we flip that? Basically confusing language. That's language games is a way that I might put that. And so I think because of that fixation on language, that I believe has led to words can be violent, words can hurt, and words can definitely hurt. I would not say that they're violent unless we redefine what violence means. And it's that redefining that I think has been dangerous, because at the end of the day, it's all existing in the space of words, language, English. And reality is much, much bigger than the words in the dictionary. And yet we become so fixated on just playing these language games. And that is an egoic impulse. But then the final thing I wanted to say, when it comes to the canceled person, so the other side, not the mob, I think in those cases, it's very similar to what I just said about if someone's job gets replaced by AI. When it comes to cancel culture, all your friends who you had been so close with, everyone rejects you and you're sort of on your own. I sort of see cancel culture, that AI stuff, and any other apocalyptic scenario you could imagine, even if it's an individual apocalypse, where the world is flipped upside down. I think all of those are stemming from the same place, assuming they haven't even happened yet. Fear of being canceled, fear of, a global disaster. They're arising as thoughts in the mind, and that is ego.
Yep. Very well said. Totally understand that. And again, it's, there's so many, we could go deep into this. I think we probably, we can kind of leave it there for now, and to promote the book, they can pick up the book and find out more. But, no, I think when I kind of think about the book and, on the spiritual side, and then kind of getting into that, polarized, digitized, tribalized component of it, from reading just the intro, one more essay, and then some of the poems, one of the components that I really got from it that you just kind of spoke to briefly was the philosophical nature of the book. For me, I come from a finance degree. I've always been more analytical. I want to get more into being more, philosophical, and I'm reading books on it, and it's very fascinating to me. But I know you've always, you've been more into that from a younger age. And I know that there's a undertone of that throughout the book. Can you maybe speak to on the philosophy side, some of your influences within the book? I believe there were some, you quoted some. I was kind of skimming through it before we started here. I saw there were some sections speaking to some philosophers. Tell us maybe a little bit about how that played a role, because I think that, again, you speak to the spiritual side and these other themes. I think that probably kind of blends into the entirety of the book, and I think it'd be interesting to kind of hear your take on that.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that I kind of forgot that is a big part of it. I'd said all the spiritual people that I feel like inspired the book, but if I had to pick a couple, and I would almost lump philosophy and psychology together, specifically with Carl Jung. He plays a big role, especially in one of the essays. His ideas have really influenced me. And then the other person that doesn't get mentioned as much, but I would say the person that got me into philosophy in general was Viktor Frankl.
Okay.
And his big book is Man's Search for Meaning. He was in the Holocaust, and basically that book is focused on his experience and really noticing that there was some, even if it was minuscule, some little bit of hope left in people, that they still had meaning in their lives. Or I should really say there was a group of people in the concentration camps who had that element of hope, that element of meaning, and they were able to live the longest. And some of them actually did see getting out and escaping. So his work is focused on meaning. I mean, obviously the book title, but the other half of that book, he focused on basically 3 ways that someone can get meaning. And I may not remember all of them right now. I know one of them is experience, going to some place that's really beautiful, that's very awe-inspiring. Mm-hmm. The other thing is doing something, doing a very meaningful thing. He was actually writing this book in the camp, or he had written it before, and he wanted to live to see this book to publishing. Mm-hmm. So that was his meaning, was that action. I'm not going to remember the third thing, but it was something similar along those veins. But just that search for meaning is something that I've always been interested in. And what I've realized in writing this book is that I actually think having a meaning that you can say in a sentence or two is a wild goose chase. I think the second I say I'm a writer and the purpose of my life is to keep writing books, well, maybe it's also to learn a musical instrument. Maybe it's to try this thing and that thing and do this and that. And suddenly, the second you name a meaning, as in like define it with words, your mind's thinking, what about this thing? What about that thing? What about that? Mm-hmm. And so what's the alternative to that is, instead of trying to name the meaning, just do the thing. Try to limit the amount of labeling of, I'm doing this because it's my purpose in life. Mm-hmm. I'm doing this because I really care about it. You would be doing it anyway. You don't have to add that extra layer again. And so there's one essay in there, which I don't think you would have seen. It's basically called Enlightened Self-Expression. And it relates to whether you're an artist, a content creator, any number of things, the stuff that I've always talked about on Purple Elephant Radio, plus the people who wouldn't consider themselves in that vein. So self-expression can also mean someone who's really passionate about playing golf, or running a business, being an entrepreneur. That is still self-expression if you're doing it with the right specific intentions. So that, I think, that idea of self-expression, I mean, if you want to say anything's philosophical in the book, I would say that is sort of a philosophy I'm putting out there, is that everyone has an urge to do something, and it's not necessarily about figuring it out in your life. It's about just do what you're doing right now, and that is the thing. Yeah. And most people can't stand that. They think, this can't be the right thing. I'm working as a server in a restaurant. That can't be my purpose in life. I can't be a server the rest of my life. Things like that. Or I'm stuck in this dead-end job. I can't be doing this that's not my actual purpose. Well, the whole point is, once you stop labeling it, then maybe you do move on to something else. Yeah. Maybe you're not so focused on making the maximum amount of money and working the maximum amount of hours you can in a week. But those changes will happen naturally. You don't have to willfully change yourself. You don't have to willfully self-improve. And that's been the biggest aha moment in this, because, in high school, in college, I've always been about self-improvement. Mm-hmm. And I'm not anymore, but I haven't given it up either. Yeah. I'm just not talking about it. Yeah. I'm doing instead of talking.
Yeah, you're really, you're kind of going right into, like, again, I know we've been having deep conversations for years now, mm-hmm. and I think it's not surprised that we're on the same page in certain things, but I took a couple notes before, this conversation, and you're speaking right to some of these things that I've been thinking about, and I brought it up multiple times already, that feel, not think. I mean, everything you're saying is very in line with that. Don't overthink it, just do it. It's like the Nike slogan, but yeah, there's a big component of that. And I know you're familiar with the term. I know Ram Dass talks about it a lot, and it's karma yoga. Mm-hmm. And you have one of your poems that had a couple lines in here that really, I think, kind of resonated with me as I think of what karma yoga is. And for those that that aren't familiar with it, it's the concept of when you're doing the dishes, and just enjoy doing the dishes. Be in the moment. Don't be thinking about, I'm doing the dishes, or
or I don't want to be doing the dishes, but I'm
watching TV. Yeah, I have to be doing this. Just do the dishes and just be in the moment doing them. So I thought this was really interesting. This is, I don't know which poem it was in. I just kind of copied the couple of these lines, but
I can link to something. Yeah, say maybe the full thing.
Yeah. So you say, we choose the labor, we embrace the toils, we pay the tolls. We were all born the alchemist, purposed in turning all lead into gold.
Yeah.
And I think that was really interesting to me, where I thought of, kind of along the same lines of everything you're just saying. So I think the poems came, I believe, at the end of the book, right?
Yeah, but they were all written first.
Yeah, so that's interesting. It's like the poems are at the end, kind of start more with the intro. On the spiritual side, you get into some of the depth of, politics and some of the, themes within what's in our world right now with social media. And then, yeah, you get back to the end of the book, which was written at the beginning, which are these poems. And the poems are, I think, really interesting. Just reading, I'm not going to read some of these other ones, but I think it's just a lot of them surround or around the topic of kind of that doing, not thinking, kind of just more that wisdom mentality. So, I think just kind of wrapping it up, if it's good with you, just kind of talking through some last pieces around going back to the kind of the beginning for, what not necessarily gave you the inspiration to write the book, but, what made you realize now was the time to write this book? Had you been thinking about writing a book for years, and this was like, hey, this is it, the time in the world where you're at personally in your life? What made, I guess, late 2023, mid 2023, the time for you to write this book, which again, haven't had a chance to read the whole thing, but from what I've read, it's very impressive, and I'm excited to read the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it just really quick to clarify, like for anyone listening, the way this book is formatted, it's introduction and essays, and then all poetry broken into 4 sections, and then an afterword. So the reason that, like, the actual process of writing this book, originally it was just going to be a book of poems with no essays. I kind of played with the idea of maybe I'll write a paragraph to like give some background to each poem. But after all the poems had been written for the most part, I was kind of shooting for 50 or so. First of all, I felt like it wouldn't have been that much of a book.
Yeah.
So I wanted some length to it. But what ultimately happened is the essays, which were written because of the poems, as like explaining the poems, and they kind of blossomed into each of their own pieces.
Oh, yeah.
The essays became the bigger thing, the more important thing. And so the actual inspiration of writing this, you could say there were kind of 2 big turning points. So originally I'd set a goal of just, I've been dabbling with writing poems, and a couple of the last like short films I did, just do a full book of them. Just see how many you can write. Don't worry about theme. Even though Off With His Head was always the title, originally that was going to be referencing like medieval stuff. So I don't know if I sent you any of the poems, but like the first 10 or so all had some like medieval theme, like something about the king's jester or queen or royalty or something along those lines. I'm like, oh yeah, that's a nice little theme that'll work well for a poem book. And I think I just, without putting any reins on myself, without saying it has to be every poem related to something medieval, it just sort of ventured further and further out, being influenced by what I was reading, what I was listening to. I happened to be rereading The Power of Now right around like April, and I had started last January. So like 3 months in, I had basically finished all the poems, started rereading that book, and that really infused itself into the essays. And so I think to answer your question, the inspiration, first of all, I don't think this 2023 to 2024 is so significant of a time. I mean, of course, you could say every passing year it gets more and more significant. Everything's going to the shit or to chaos, however you want to
Great or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just that cultural feeling. It's in the air, for better or for worse. Yeah. But I don't think that was the thing that pushed me to do it now. I think it really did come more as an outpouring than a like response to, I've got to act to stop this from happening.
Yeah.
It was that time, but there's no way to put it other than that. Yeah, organic.
Yeah.
And that's what I said at the very start. The writing process was block out time to write, write, and see what comes from it. And the organization of this book, the way I ordered everything, was the final step. I wasn't considering about how the essays are related until they were all written to where I wanted to have them in there.
Okay.
And that's why now I can say the book is about the ego. I didn't realize that, halfway through writing the essays or the poems.
Yeah, I'm glad you explained kind of the breakout of the book, because I meant to ask you about that, but I forgot. Just kind of categorize, again, what the order is, because I know it's important. It's not your traditional book just with, an intro and then chapters until the end. No, that's great. Yeah, I think that for me, just again, being someone that at some point I think has a desire to write a book, don't think it's yet. Kind of just lastly, last point on my end would be just any tips on if you're going to do this. And again, it might just be what you just talked about, again, just start, block out some time, write. But are there any other tips you'd have for someone listening to this podcast, or, anybody that's looking to get into writing? And maybe, maybe it's just start with journaling. I know there's a lot of, again, going back to more of this like analytical, science-based, it's like, yeah, journaling is really good for your health and it's good for, mindfulness. Are there any kind of thoughts or, tips you would have for someone that's interested in getting into writing or writing a book, or, anything kind of that to cap it off?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that. I was not really expecting to hear, like, I haven't really thought about that too much, but I would say the main thing is, and this is like the aha moment, especially if I compare the last thing I did, the Purple Elephant Artist, which was much closer to like a magazine,
read that,
blog posts and stuff like that. But the biggest difference between then and now is don't try to be original. Don't try to set yourself apart and do something that's so distinct. And that seems so counterintuitive. But what ultimately happens, and I actually heard this from when I did an interview way back when with Nick Potter, he was one of my teachers in college. He had said, and he does comic book art. He had said when he tries to replicate an artist whose style he really likes, he ends up making something that is not quite there. It's not exactly mimicking the style, not intentionally. I mean, he's trying to just emulate that style. Mm-hmm. It becomes something on its own just by the very nature that he is a different person. I am a different person with different world experiences than any of the authors that I've been talking about so far. Mm-hmm. And so once that concern of, I have to be original, I have to write something that's never been said before, never been thought before, originality just comes out. And there is no like added level of having to try to be original. And then more of a formatting technical thing, once you get to the book making process, do everything in your power to make it look like a real book. Because I've accidentally bought a handful of self-published books that are just, the formatting ruins the read. And so it's not like I'm so great at making books, but I really notice as a reader myself, if a book is formatted weird, if the text is really tiny, it fills up the whole page, I can't read the book. So that is an added thing to think about much later in the process. But like that should be treated just as important as the content, is how you're delivering it.
Okay. Makes sense.
But yeah, the don't be original is probably the most important.
Yeah. I mean, hearing you talk about that, immediately kind of what came to my mind is, the concept of like imposter syndrome. And it's like in our heads, we always are telling ourselves we're not good enough. We're not good enough. We have to try to really be original, or, it's like, I think at the end of the day, like you said, even if you maybe are, taking a couple of different, takes from Jung or Frankel or, Eckhart, it's like at the end of the day, you are you. You've lived this, life that you've lived, and it's unique, and it's, people are going to appreciate your story. And, that's how I feel reading this, for, I know I'm older than you, and it's like, if you go by age, it's like I have more years, I have more wisdom. You've experienced things drastically different than I have in my life, even though we grew up in the same town. And that's what I love about reading a book and an artist and an author is everyone's got such a fresh take, and I can't wait to read this. I think it's from what I've seen so far, it's an awesome piece of work. To cap it off, I know you probably have it in here, but anybody else that you want to shout out? I know there was some folks that, helped along the way. Anybody that you want to give some props to?
Yeah. So I'd say, first of all, the big shout out would have to go to my girlfriend, Sveta Wannenberg. It's only a few illustrations that she has in the book related to the poetry, but sort of the unsung hero, the thing that you can't really quantify, is the fact that she listened to every essay I was writing as I was writing it, every poem. It just gave me an ear to bounce ideas off of. So I would say she is the biggest one, and then coming in a very close second would be my dad. He was the editor for this book, so editing all the grammar for everything. But if there are any editing mistakes, it would have been because I've been editing and tweaking actually after he did like a whole run through. So I think that, and same thing. I mean, I asked him as he was giving me the grammar edits, just let me know what you think. Because, you talked about different worldviews. Yeah. I know my dad thinks so differently from me and from you. And so just hearing what he thought, because I think, at least with Sveta, her thoughts are more aligned with mine, or at least more open to it. But hearing from someone like my dad, hearing what he liked, what he was confused by, really, really helped me kind of craft the message to get it across, to make sure someone with no experience, no understanding of everything we've been talking in this conversation, ego, mysticism, Hindu philosophies, Buddhist philosophies, see if he enjoys it. See if he got something from it, even if he can't say exactly what. So yeah, those would be the two big ones. And then of course you for doing this interview and also for reading the book. So I'd say you guys are the big three in this.
I appreciate it, even though I definitely don't deserve nearly credit of those two. But no, that all makes sense. Again, and I think when you speak to your dad, obviously knowing him and just kind of his views, and not that they're, far different from yours or mine, but I think that's kind of the part of the book too that we talked about earlier on, right? Is having folks that have different views or from different generations reading and talking about this with other folks, and just again having conversations and trying to bridge the gap and all trying to come together more, rather than having this such a divisive nature of this world as it currently exists today. So I think that from what I've read, this book is going to help accomplish that. I mean, just to cap it off on my end, super proud of you. I think it's an awesome accomplishment. I can't wait to finish reading it, or really read the majority of it, and one day ask you more detailed questions on how to write a book. But for now, just again, super proud of you. Congrats on this, and I'll let you have the last words on anything else you want to say.
So book is going to be released on February 16th. So I'm going to have a hardcover edition and then a paperback edition. I mean, I just want people to read this. If anyone who knows me personally, if they just want a free PDF copy, you can let me know, comment, send me something on Instagram. That is ultimately the goal. Of course, I want to make some money from selling this book, but I didn't spend a year of my life to write a book with not a clear target market and, self-publish, all these elements. I'm writing because I want the message to be heard. So yes, keep an eye out. I don't know if I'm going to release this interview before the release, probably right around the same time. So check the link in the description, whether you're listening on Spotify or on YouTube, and you will see a link to buy the book, or it will be there soon enough. Thank you everyone for listening, and thank you, Zach, for doing this interview. I'll see you on the next episode.
If you like this episode, it would mean a hell of a lot if you rated it on Spotify, on iTunes, left a nice review. Thank you.